Welcome you to this morning's conference day. I'm Leon Balsan. I'm the president of Bard College, and my role here is entirely ceremonial. But I did not want the conference to go by without, on behalf of the institution, expressing my thanks to Roger Berkowitz and to his colleagues for organizing this conference and for developing a terrific center here at Bard, which bears Hannah Arendt's name. I also want to, I know there were students on a panel yesterday, and those students that are here from the various programs of the college, I want particularly to welcome them. One of the ambitions of the center has been to make sure that the conversation covers more than one generation and particularly reaches down to the student generation. I have nothing particular to say about the subject itself. I'm not a political scientist, and I'm not an expert on these matters by any means. But it'll come as no surprise to you that I share the view that the moment we're in this country is severely difficult and challenging. And I say that not only as an individual citizen, a naturalized citizen, but also as someone responsible for an institution of higher learning in our current political climate. The question of citizenship and civil disobedience is not a remote one. There are any number of issues that make this very timely. My own impression, which is only a subjective impression, is that the things that concern me about the whole question, and it's even reflected in this event, where the internet audience is larger than the real audience. And I'm not persuaded that the virtual space is a political space or is politically relevant. It's not because I'm older, which is something I can do nothing about, and something I actually cherish. But it is also that politics and the social context of human existence, I don't think can be effectively rendered virtual, and that insofar as we are deluded into believing that our intercommunications and that the virtual world is a surrogate or even superior, I don't want to go as far as to say that Facebook is a threat to democracy, but the whole idea of a social networking absent the physical community of public space is dangerous and easily manipulated, as we have discovered. It also, I think, threatens a certain amount of apathy, a Rousseau-like apathy that if one's on the internet and one twitters and one blogs, one has done something, when one has actually done nothing at all. And that the volume of the conversation, with the exception of the President of the United States, dwarfs any significance it can have. So I fear a strange mixture of activity and apathy in the political space. I think we have to look at the possibility that the elections will go badly in 2018, and even worse in 2020. And this is not a temporary phenomenon. that the sort of unimaginable presidency that we're in actually will become a kind of system, or will somehow lend itself to a more permanent state of affairs. I think this is catastrophic for democracy, and not dissimilar from the circumstances in its own American way, from European circumstances, which you all know about, which I happen to have a direct involvement with in my role as chairman of the board of the Central European University, and that is in Hungary with the government of Viktor Orban. The cult of personality, the mesmerization of everyone by the behavior of a cult-like figure who is in his own mendacious way brilliant and gifted in the manipulation of attention and in setting the agenda. So the question is, what is citizenship in that context? In my view, just only my view, what we lack in fighting back and persuading our fellow citizens of all character to go beyond the present condition is actually a set of very easily communicable ideas that can unite what is clearly a widespread opposition to President Trump and what he seems to stand for other than himself. And those are hard things to actually speak because they don't have a lot of traction. Civil disobedience, citizenship, in my view, has to be a political action in support of a certain view of what the society is going to be like. That's what he has offered, with all the slogans, with the nativist appeal, with the Make America Great Again, and stuff like that. And they're pretty simple issues. One is wealth distribution and inequality. It's not about the economic well-being of the citizens, it's about being actually to garner enough resources to restore the second concern of mine, the public sector, which isn't working. We happen to operate in 5 cities with public high schools, and we see government. And the level of public service, people talk about the extension of Medicaid, but what's the quality of the medical care that even goes through Medicaid? The standard of how government functions with its public is clearly not good enough. And we actually don't recruit first-grade talent into the public sector. The confidence in government is completely eroded. We need to do something, fundamental about the infrastructure of the country. We have to do fundamentally something about education, both its access and its quality. We have to be as bold as he has been in creating a debt by a tax cut. Why can't we forgive all the student loans that are outstanding? No? Why can't we do the same thing? I'd rather be fiscally brave and rescue democracy than be fiscally prudent and live under an encroaching tyranny. It doesn't seem much of a choice. There's an absence of boldness of vision and clarity. We need to find some way to persuade the public that this is not only wrong but bad for them, and that there's a better way to structure the country. And that the idea that citizenship is shared by all, no matter the identities of the individuals who hold it, that the rule of law, the protection of citizenship, and the openness to immigration and to those constituents that make up a truly diverse country, that is the miracle of this country. The name Hannah Arendt evokes many things, but one thing that one ought to be continually reminded of is the fact that she had an extremely romantic vision of America as having a concept of citizenship which did not require birth, ethnicity, or language, that could be acquired legally, and where that acquisition would result in equality of citizenship, not second-class citizenship. That's a principle that's being threatened now by the current government. Let alone to restore, especially in the internet space and the current space, the confidence in the rules of reason and of language and argument and evidence. Much is being made of the census that will be done in 2020, and legitimate concerns about whether that census will be fair, and whether those people who might feel that they are at risk by actually participating, because the information they give might be used against them, that the fear, the mistrust, which plays into the hands of efforts to minimize the actual population numbers in certain groups and in certain areas of the country. The tragedy of that is that whatever the census does, even if it were completely demographically and scientifically well done, the ability to contest things that are true and defensible is legion, that nothing is more easily to undermine than numbers and statistics, and that to create a climate in which the country can, in its conversation, agree as to what is the case, that there actually was a hurricane, actually homes were destroyed, that there is climate change, and that there's a reason to know things, but things that we don't know. That ground is in danger. And for that reason, what we do in higher education is also at risk unless the political context in which we operate in a democracy and in freedom is restored. So political action is necessary, and collectively, and with some unity and some clearness of vision. Otherwise, the splintering of small interests and those who are opposed to the predominant party now in government will be outmaneuvered. And what we hope to be a temporary nightmare will be turned into a permanent, quite a permanent reality. And my hope is that political action can be organized in a way where we come to some agreement about what we want to see happen, and not fight each other. And successfully push back, because if in fact we succeed, there's the opportunity actually to move the idea of democracy and citizenship in the United States forward from not restoratively, not to where it was, which wasn't all that good, into a better place. But that is a very optimistic scenario, and I would suggest that at this current moment, it pays to be pessimistic. We are at our peril in not taking seriously the enormity of the danger we face, which the Kavanaugh nomination made plain as day. So I wish you a very successful conference. I again want to thank Roger and his colleagues and all my colleagues here at Bard for doing this. We're very proud of the center and the tradition it represents. And I think it's my pleasure now to invite Kevin Dong to the podium, and he will carry on with the first panel. Thank you all for coming.
So good morning to everyone, and welcome to the first panel of the second day of the Hannah Arendt Center Conference. Welcome to everyone. Thanks to the President for his opening remarks. As the first panel of our day on violent and nonviolent protest, I'm happy to introduce our two speakers for today. Let me start by introducing Mark Bray to my left. Mark is a historian of human rights, terrorism, and political radicalism in modern Europe at Dartmouth College. And he's the author of the national bestseller, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook by Melville House in 2017. Translating Anarchy, the Anarchism of Occupy Wall Street, published in 2013. The Anarchist Inquisition, Terrorism and Human Rights in Spain and France, 1890 to 1910, which is forthcoming. And he's also the co-editor of Anarchist Education and the Modern School, a Francisco Ferrer Reader, just came out in 2018? Coming out right now. And his work has appeared in numerous places, including the Washington Post, Boston Review, Foreign Policy, and numerous edited volumes. I'm also happy to introduce David Bromwich. So you'll notice on your programs that we originally scheduled to have Uday Mehta, but he wasn't able to join us here today. So we're happy to have David here instead. He is the Sterling Professor of English at Yale University, and he's taught and written about British and American Romanticism, Shakespeare, modern poetry, and the rhetoric of persuasion. And his books include Hazlitt, The Mind of a Critic from 1983, and The Intellectual Life of Edmund Burke, From the Sublime and Beautiful to American Independence from 2014. And his political commentaries on the Cheney, Bush, Obama, and Trump presidencies have appeared in the Huffington Post, Anti-War, Dissent, New York Review of Books, Mondovice, Tom Dispatch, The Nation, and the London Review of Books. So please join me in welcoming Mark and David to Bard. So Mark, do you want to go and begin? Great.
Can I close this laptop, or would that screw things up just to put my paper on it? Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Thank you for that introduction, Kevin. Thank you to Roger and Samantha and everyone that made this possible. I'm going to speak about violence and nonviolence today. My main purpose, though, is to really address all of the unaddressed assumptions and political perspectives that inform what we think of as violence and nonviolence, because all too often we have a conversation about what is or is not violent, what is or is not politically useful or ethical, without addressing the context in which these conversations happen. So I would throw out as like a potential ground rule for consideration is to never, or very rarely, say that violence or nonviolence in the abstract, without context, is good or bad or indifferent, but try to situate it in a context, situate it in a politics, and really be very specific about what we're talking about. I think that might be useful regardless of your perspective. It's really interesting to discuss what is or is not violent, but personally, I'm less interested in that than I am in how society views what is or is not violent. For me, it's about that definition. So I think it's important to understand these terms contextually, historically, and how popular receptions to different types of action have been changed over time and have been actively constructed by different historical actors, different political movements in time. We didn't just naturally end up where we are with the perspectives we have. The perspectives we have on what is called violence, what is called nonviolence, have been very intentionally created by different political movements and actors over time. We also need to understand these terms politically. And I think look at tactics and how people respond to them politically and think about them in terms of what the goals of our different actions and our different campaigns are. I'm also going to throw out a sort of unpopular but I think thought-provoking perspective, which is that not all political actions or political movements need to gain majority approval in order to be successful. Now, I am very much committed to popular politics. I've been involved in several social movements. I think long-term transformation definitely needs mass support. But you can be successful with a lot of people thinking that you're not doing what you ought to be doing. There are a number of examples. I mean, for example, if you look at strikes, strikes can be successful even if society thinks the strikers' demands are illegitimate if they can garner enough economic pressure on their boss to accede to their demands. For example, the Washington Post, I think a year or two ago, published interesting statistics from the civil rights movement about how in 1961, only 22% of the general public approved of the actions of the Freedom Riders, only 28% approved of the actions of lunch counter sit-in activists, and only 15% of white people back in 1961 thought that civil rights demonstrations helped the situation of African Americans. Actually, that last statistic was 1966, excuse me. Moreover, I've been writing about anti-fascism, and I have a number of documented cases in my book, Antifa, where anti-fascists have been successful in stopping small, medium-scale neo-Nazi groups without the public ever hearing about what they did or necessarily approving of their tactics. Let's talk about protest a little. The default understanding of protest in society is that politics is it really that protests are a subset of politics, which is about holding signs and voting. In our country, really, most politics at a popular level are assumed as voting or holding signs. Anything else is considered a quote-unquote mob, as the Republicans have attempted to paint the anti-Kavanaugh protesters, and by extension, the entire left. So this norm that change happens through the ballot box or it happens through hearts and minds in the abstract public sphere is really it. Everything else is anathema. So that norm creates a powerful pull that pulls politics towards it. In the past, I've called it protest as election, where the success or failure of a protest is thought to have everything to do with the percentage of society that gives it kind of a metaphorical thumbs up, rather than seeing it as a contestation over power. And this norm of protest as election, where protests are seen as essentially live action opinion polls, allows politicians, pundits, and activists to argue that acquiescing to this standard will alienate fewer people and therefore is the most effective way of doing politics. So based on this perspective, the recipe for success is to get as close to as possible to what people already think and encourage them to behave politically in ways that they are already most receptive to. The danger there, of course, is that the more you mirror the society you want to change, the more you become that society. So, for example, one iteration of that might be a critique of some of the anti-Kavanaugh protests, for example, because they have fueled a certain section of the Republican base. So you could, based on this perspective, say, you see, you shouldn't be so confrontational, you shouldn't be so upset, you should be civil. I don't think that that one-dimensional recipe is actually how successful social movements work, but we can get into that later. Moreover, rarely in any successful or significant social movement is there only one way of doing politics, is there only one tactical formula. So any assessment of any group or any tactics needs to situate it within that wider context if you really want to understand what's going on. Not all politics is simply about changing the minds of one's opponents. You can win in a campaign without necessarily convincing those who disagree with you. We should think in terms of power, not just in terms of abstract opinion. The assumption, of course, is that what we call nonviolent protest tactics are the best way to convince the people who disagree with you to join your protest and therefore gain as much popular participation as possible. But what do we think of as nonviolent protest tactics? That, to me, is not always self-evident. So I'm going to run through a few examples of things that might or might not be considered nonviolent protest tactics, and we can think about them. So how about breaking windows or damaging property where no living being is harmed? A lot of debates in social movement circles about this. It certainly was a successful tactic for British suffragettes, but I think most Americans would think of that as violent. What about workplace sabotage? A hallmark of the labor movement, but not really what people think in terms of nonviolent action. What about blocking roadways, subways, entrances to banks, blocking police stations, occupying ICE offices, squatting abandoned property? Not exactly what people think of in terms of nonviolent action. What about kneeling or sitting during the national anthem? More people would support that, but many say it's not the right place or the right time, that one shouldn't politicize sports or disasters or tragedies, et cetera, et cetera. What about boycotts? Yeah, people love boycotts. What about boycotting Israel as part of the BDS movement against the occupation of Palestine? Not as popular. What about interrupting racist speakers? What about yelling at politicians like Ted Cruz at restaurants or refusing to serve them, like what happened with Sarah Huckabee Sanders? What about confronting Ivanka Trump on an airplane, making her feel uncomfortable during a vacation? What about doxing, where you publicize someone's personal information to make their life more difficult, as is often done with neo-Nazis? What about throwing fake blood, pieing, glitter bombing, flag burning, shoplifting, looting? These are all examples where you could make a case that these are nonviolent actions, but these are wildly unpopular for the most part. Why? Because these things are often illegal and or uncivil. Civility is the box into which nonviolent protest is expected to fit. And you can't talk about the efficacy or political ramifications of protest in terms of violence and nonviolence without addressing civility. Of course, the dimensions of this box were designed to limit the scope of resistance and reinforce the myth of national unity or bipartisanship or whatever you want to call it. And so in that way, most forms of nonviolent resistance are actually super controversial. And when we talk about nonviolence, we're really actually referring to a very small cross-section of what could be considered nonviolent, really a handful of things, holding signs, doing a sit-in. So if you advocate for civility, that's fine, but I think you need to be willing to answer the question, when are things grave enough for you to agree with escalating tactically? Is it when fascists are marching in the streets? Is it when Black and brown people are being systematically murdered and caged? Is it when we have a climate apocalypse a decade away? In the future, will they look back and say, sure, they let corporations and the military wreck the planet, but they sure were civil? What about violence? What do we consider to be violence? Let's start with the most violent institution in human history. Which one is that? I think if I were to poll people about which is the most violent institution in human history, a lot of people really wouldn't get the right answer. The answer is the state. Few people would offer it as an answer because the violence of the state is so normalized and taken for granted that it is made invisible. Few even utter the name of its organizational structure. I would offer that you cannot actually call yourself an enemy of violence or a pacifist if you do not offer your harshest criticism to the violence of the state. Now, we can argue that the state is legitimate violence, that it adequately represents the will of the people. But then we're actually taking a step away from violence or nonviolence in the abstract into a political argument, which is exactly my point. The irony is that self-proclaimed pacifist activists who assist the police in apprehending violent protesters are actually engaging in more violence than those that they condemn. It is rather strange talking about anti-fascism in the public where the media says that the violent ones are the anti-fascists who actually, as part of their political agenda, aim to abolish the police, military, and prisons, but yet their occasional physical confrontations with the fascists are the relevant violence. True for me as well, with my critics. I've been involved in nonviolent social movements for nearly 2 decades, to a greater extent than most of the people who criticize me for being violent. I'm a pretty nonviolent guy. So I would actually argue that get ready for this one. I would actually argue that there is no nonviolent way to stop fascism. There is only that which trusts the violence of the state to do it, and that which does not. Because fascism is inherently violent. It will inherently come for those people that it wants to destroy unless it is met with superior force. That could be the police. If that's your perspective, that's fine, but that's violence. If you ever think that violence is okay, then again, you have to think about how your positionality influences when you think it's okay. We're all familiar with the poem, "First They Came for the Socialists, I Did Not Speak Up Because I Was a Socialist." The assumption of that poem is it's in everyone's interest to stand up or eventually they'll come for you. But if you read, for example, What We Knew, which was a book of oral histories of people who lived through Nazi Germany, you'd find out that if you were a German in the 1930s and 40s who were not part of one of the demographics that the Nazis wanted to exterminate, you did not have to worry for them coming for you. That actually, quote-unquote, everyday Germans lived relatively carefree lives under the Third Reich and could actually engage in a wide variety of illegality and criminality because they were not the other. So the point being, if you're not one of the demographics that is being come for, think about how that affects your perspective on self-defense. I mean, I think about the experience of my Jewish ancestors who were exterminated in Poland in the 1940s. And to me, that kind of experience informs my perspective on self-defense and nonviolence. If there is a time when self-defense is legitimate, and I would strongly argue that that would be such a time, the question is, how bad does it have to get? And we can disagree on the answer to that, but you have to have an answer, I believe. But this panel focuses actually on the role of violence or nonviolence in protest. And most of the circumstances when most people would be most sympathetic to the use of violence in politics actually don't quite fall into what we traditionally think of as protests. Like, for example, resistance to the Nazis in Eastern Europe in the 1940s, not exactly what we come to mind when we think of protest. And so in that way, since the most legitimate uses of political violence don't happen in what we think of as protests, it reinforces the notion that violent protest is bad or counterproductive. We think of protest as the exceptional, as the corrective remedy to keep a system on track. The slogan, "Protest is patriotic," that protesting actually helps the status quo. But what about when protest is not patriotic? We're talking a lot about citizenship here, but I think we also need to recognize that even if we do things as citizens, the history of citizenship is the history of exclusion. Citizenship means nothing if it does not mean excluding those who are non-citizens. Not to mention, of course, the omissions in history of the citizen being originally thought of as male, as white, and so forth. So I'm much less interested in having conversations about what we can do as citizens than how we can build a world without borders where no one is illegal. Any protest that does not, in one way or another, explicitly or implicitly aim to weaken the violence of the state ultimately serves to reinforce the violence of the state. We talk a lot about violence and nonviolence and protests in terms of tactics, but rarely in terms of political content. So we talk about nonviolent or violent protests, but what about protests for violence? Like for tighter immigration controls that therefore forcibly detain and cage human beings. I would argue that's a protest for violence. In many cases, such quote-unquote peaceful protests end up producing more violence than those that engage in what could be called violent tactics. What about protests for the jailing of a killer cop? It's a protest in favor of an act of violence, forcibly locking up a police officer in a cage that aims to reduce the violence overall by getting a killer cop off the streets and disincentivizing police murder. It's a protest for an act of violence to cut down on acts of violence. Now, if this is all becoming kind of confusing and long-winded and difficult to follow, that's the point, because that's what happens if you look at it apolitically, simply in terms of acts for or against violence, without actually seeing it as part of broader politics. So again, violence or nonviolence in the abstract to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Situating it does make sense. I'm about to wrap up by listing my four, if I could break it down, 4 main points for your consideration from this talk. Number 1, let's look at violence and nonviolence historically and contextually in a way that resists lumping wide ranges of tactical and strategic action into a singular, flat, ahistorical category. Number 2, let's look at violence and nonviolence politically and holistically without ever for an instant naturalizing the greatest violence of all, that of the state. Number 3, this conversation is not primarily about violence. It's mainly about sovereignty and political legitimacy. How are the terms defined? Who gets included? Who gets excluded? How is it violence or how is it nonviolence when a sheriff evicts someone from their home, but it's violence if they fight back to hold on to their house? When, where, and how can violence be deployed? Terms like political violence or even terrorism are rhetorical weapons in the service of sovereignty. Even if we look at, Roger Berkowitz's very interesting talk yesterday, he quoted Hannah Arendt as defining violence, at least in that circumstance, as taking the law into one's own hands. Taking the law into one's own hands. That's a definition of violence that inherently privileges the violence of the state. And finally, this debate will never be resolved. Sorry, not today, not anytime soon. So, rather than assuming that we will ever be able to convince each other, I think we should recognize how the dichotomy of violence and nonviolence is a wedge that creates a way to split and demonize resistance. If you are not asking these questions with a commitment to resistance and building power, then you will probably come up with answers that reinforce the existing regime of violence, whether in the name of violence or nonviolence. Thank you. I want to add one quick little thing. Also, one other quick little thing. I've noticed a tendency of some moderators to call on people assuming their gender identities, and let's not do that.
So, you've just heard as Mark Bray told me he would be delivering a talk on historical contexts for violence with emphasis on the always prior condition of the overwhelming violence of the state. He speaks as an anarchist, as a not necessarily always pro-violent anarchist. One assumption behind his talk, and it what to say, grew in intensity as the talk went on, is that the violence of the state is something we all realize to ourselves as a permanent condition. I would put it to you that the state is a construction, an artificial construction. It is the force that has the monopoly on the use of legitimate violence, but that the state, to the extent that people can conceive of it at all, is not perpetually an instrumentality of violence in the lives of most people. Stop signs aren't experienced as an act of violence. Delivery of mail by the postal system is not experienced as an act of violence. So, you know, when you hear the sort of dichotomy on which Mark Bray ended, bear that in mind as part of your experience. Not only that the state is something we in a democracy have a part in creating and modifying, but that the state is a convenience, maybe a convenience that we overrate because we don't want to be disturbed by demands for justice, but nevertheless something we don't always experience as an insult or an imposition on us, or we all only experience it as that, excuse me, let me start that sentence again, or that the only reason we would not experience it as a constant assault on our freedom and dignity is that we are too privileged, that we are the protected. There are a great many people whom it would be unfair to describe as either downtrodden or privileged, who just like the mail being delivered on time and on the whole prefer to live with stop signs rather than without them. The same goes for the word civility, which Mark Bray's talk made out to be pretty much, as a persistent thing, an excuse for violence by powers outside ourselves that we just don't perceive properly. Think about the role of civility or the reverse of civility in your own lives. It has to do with politeness. It has to do with a decent approach towards people. Yeah, that decency can be just a veil, a covering to hide terrible injustices, but think of it within a family. You want to think of family as a system of domination and injustice, be my guest. But there are ways of interacting with people that are assumed to be better than other ways, and civility is a poor name, but maybe still the best we have for that. I myself have opposed the use of civility by particularly education leaders as a way of suppressing free debate. But I'm a defender of the First Amendment, and I think the First Amendment allows for incivility so long as it does not enter into the realm of physical violence, disruption, or intolerant inhibition of somebody else's right to speak. So those are just some initial reservations. I'll be talking not about the state, but about society and its relation to the individual, including the individual protester. It's been said that with or without right, revolution will always be the last resource of the thinking and the good. The reason is a revolution turns a society upside down. It causes disruptions that are hard to repair, makes a society changed overall in ways that are hard to get back. And anyone who has talked to a person who survived or came just after the Russian Revolution of 1917 will be aware of the grave reservations even supporters of that revolution had about its effects. So here are four, I think, common sense reasons for engaging in the overturn of society and with it the state. The object of the change, the object involved, what you're looking at, must be great. The evil must be great. The abuse, the abuses in question must show no sign of abating. You know that they're going to continue on their course or grow worse unless something is done about them. And there's no other means of remedy at hand. Nothing that will not create so vast a disturbance, disruption, violence, deaths, and so on. If you look at American society today, and let's look at it even pessimistically in the light suggested by President Botstein a few moments ago, well, the object must be great. What is the object that we want? Let's say a peaceful and equitable society and a planet that remains habitable. We're not getting that under current conditions. That great object is not being supported. We are against, let's say, growing inequality and the unrepresentative character of our representative government. So the object being great and the evil being great, I think, are conditions that do obtain now, that do justify the use of a quite formerly unthinkable means to achieve a good end. Does the abuse show no sign of abating? Do we know that it will continue to get worse? Has it been getting worse for a long time? I want to point out, just as a little reminder, that the first African-American president of the United States was elected twice and served as president between 2009 and 2016. That could hardly have been thought of even 20 years before, but it happened. It didn't happen that long ago. Are the experiences of the last 23 months sufficient to create a doubt in our minds so great that we will now say the abuse shows no sign of abating, it will continue to grow worse unless some violent impediment is introduced in its way? And fourth, there's no other means of remedy at hand. Well, during the 2 terms of Obama's presidency, the Democrats lost upward of 1,000 persons as representatives in the state legislatures. That was, I will put forward, in some part a fault of negligence by the National Democratic Party, whose leading figure was Barack Obama. One of his faults was insufficient attention to that kind of detail. It is imaginable that an opposition party leadership will arise, and not too distant a future, that will attend to the state legislatures more. The states can conceivably be means of reform that are not violent, not spontaneous action kinds of reform. Gay marriage became legitimate within the last decade, unimaginable at any previous time in the century. That's not yet abolished. The prospect of its abolition doesn't seem very close. So for the abuses showing no sign of abating, that emergency feeling, and the lack of any other means for introducing a reform, I think those 2 conditions are not met. And I'm as apprehensive as Mark Bray and as Leon Botstein about the dangers we face. But I would ask us a dry, sober look at the facts, just the very thing that our feverish and chaotic president is unable to do. Mahatma Gandhi was very keen on distinguishing nonviolent resistance, as he called it, from passive disobedience. He wanted the word nonviolent to be the adjective, not the word passive. There is a great difference between the two. I'm going to take you on a short little excursus on Gandhi's thinking, and I would ask you to recall or introduce you to the fact that Gandhi is a thinker. His published works run to 100 volumes, and you can buy them, I'm told, by a colleague of mine so cheaply that the cost of postage from India is greater than the cost of the books themselves. What is violent action? Gandhi taught his readers and the participants in his movement to examine the violence in themselves. What is it? What does it mean when we grow angry, suddenly angry, or enraged, and want to act punitively toward the object that has aroused us? What would it be to generalize that emotion? It takes some thinking. And it takes some thinking probably in the presence of the possibility of remorse in oneself for violence that one has done or contemplated doing. War and imperial domination have been the rule of human interactions. You can put them all down to the state, but from what we know of the development of human nature, from the apes and the earliest versions of creatures walking on two legs like us, those patterns of domination set in earlier. Many things that were once the rule are wrong. Could it be that violence is one of those things? This was also a part of the gospel of Christianity as delivered by Jesus Christ, and it was the part that won over Martin Luther King Jr., who had religious beliefs not exactly coincident with those of Gandhi, but it was the study of the preaching, not of Paul, not of the apostles, but of Jesus, that made Martin Luther King, studying Gandhi too, the preacher of nonviolence, as a form of action, as a form by which to achieve radical reform, made him the kind of figure that he was. A revolution seeks to use violence in order to achieve the termination of violence. And here I would echo, but with a different meaning, something that Mark Bray said just a moment. We don't want to mirror the society that we mean to change. I'll repeat, revolutions use violence to achieve the termination of violence. The question that is hard to ask is, how will you have trained yourself for this end by the energy you employ as a means? Not how bad is the object, how violent is the state, how ugly are some of the sayings of the Tea Party, how unthinkably crass and base are the utterances of the president who exerts so much power in so many directions on us right now. Not that, not how great would it be to get rid of all these evils, but what am I doing to myself? What is the work I'm performing on myself as I get rid of them? This question, what am I doing to myself, is omitted in almost all discussions of politics and in the history of political theory, as well as among the tacticians of political action. And it is a question that Mark Bray does not bring up in the thoughts he asked you to consider. Gandhi did seek to coax from his followers thoughts about this very matter of what are we doing, what do we represent, who are we, not how bad are they, constantly. And he did it through the doctrine of ahimsa, non-violence, in the belief that thinking is rare but desirable to achieve, that we are surrounded by violence in the world outside us and in ourselves, and it is only by clearing that away, as clouds may clear on a day that becomes serene, it's only by doing that that we are able to think about our actions in the world. That's ahimsa, nonviolence. And it goes with the other famous word Gandhi has introduced even into English-speaking vocabulary, satyagraha, truth, and the idea of living with truth. This doesn't come to us all that naturally. It doesn't come in society to those in power. It doesn't come in society to those who are in dire straits or who become dissidents. That's worth achieving, and it's worth achieving for the reform of society too. So you're not always asking, who are they? Why are they so wrong? What must I do to crush the wrong they are bringing to us? But also, who are we? What are we doing to ourselves? And I will put it to you from personal experience, from introspection. I don't pretend to have it be true for everyone in the audience. But it seems to me from observation that it's true of quite a large number of people in the world, perhaps men a little more than women. Violence is exciting. It's going out of your head. Sometimes it can be done with discipline or begin with discipline, but go to other places. Paramilitary groups of the left and right know this experience. It's interesting to be a soldier in a platoon. Forcing another person or a group of people to bow to your will is interesting and exciting. We, if we're old enough, witnessed this mood in America in the years 2002 to 2004. The reaction against the bombing of the World Trade Center, the extreme, brutal, violent defensiveness that arose as a national mood in this country, the talk about torture and legitimating torture, which led to the practice of it, unheard of before, unheard of as a legitimate thing. And finally, the bombing, invasion, and occupation of Iraq on false pretenses. Violent thoughts led to all that, and we're still not out of that mood as a nation. This is getting a little longer than I thought it would be, so I'm going to close with two passages from Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience. Both of them familiar, I think, but they work together in ways that bear some reflection. He is talking about the injustice of paying taxes for the war with Mexico, which is also a war to extend slavery. And Thoreau sees no just cause why he should in any way contribute to the support of slavery in the United States. It is not clear at every point in this essay whether he therefore considers the United States government of his time to be corrupt and insupportable, but it's clear that the thoughts of this paragraph that I'm about to read bear on both a particular action and the potential for generalizing that action. And he says, if the injustice is part of the necessary friction of the machine of government, let it go. Let it go. Perchance it will wear smooth, certainly the machine will wear out. If the injustice has a spring or a pulley or a rope or a crank exclusively for itself, then perhaps you may consider whether the remedy will not be worse than the evil. Are there existing checks, balances, counteractions built into the system? For example, right now, the lower courts and the extent to which they have provided friction against the worst suggested policies of this president on immigration. But if it is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of the injustice, if the state is forcing you constantly to do things that are against your understanding of right and wrong, for example, forcing you to give up somebody who's been your neighbor for 20 years because he or she is now hunted by the immigration authorities, then I say break the law. Let your life, and he means your way of life as well as your physical being, be a counter-friction to stop the machine. What I have to do is to see at any rate that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn. Notice the defense of the self involved there, the same as I was mentioning. In Gandhi, who was of course a reader of Thoreau, this was one of the texts that made him think. Then Thoreau's vision of society, which comes from spending a night in prison. It was like traveling into a far country, he says, such as I had never expected to behold, to lie there for one night. It seemed to me that I never had heard the town clock strike before, nor the evening sounds of the village, for we slept with the windows open, which were inside the grating. It was to see my native village in the light of the Middle Ages, and our Concord was turned into a Rhine stream, and visions of knights and castles passed before me. They were the voices of old burghers that I heard in the streets. I was an involuntary spectator and auditor of whatever was done and said in the kitchen of the adjacent village inn, a wholly new and rare experience to me. It was a closer view of my native town. I was fairly inside of it. I never had seen its institutions before. This is one of its peculiar institutions, for it is a shire town. He's talking about the jail as a peculiar institution. I began to comprehend what its inhabitants were about. That is a not unfriendly view of the neighbors he disagrees with and whose law-abidingness he is dissenting from. And it's that sort of mingling with people even against whom one may be working politically and socially that seems to me an important lesson of Thoreau and Gandhi and Martin Luther King. And it seems to me that Thoreau's emphasis on being alone with myself, seeing what it is that constitutes my motive, my reason for dissent, is also essential to the idea of what protest can be if it's minded to act on behalf of right, to care about what one is doing to oneself, as well as to provide a counter-friction to an utterly visible, transparent wrong. Okay?
Thanks for those two presentations. I have some questions myself, but maybe I'll save them for later. And why don't we go ahead and open the floor for questions from the audience, and then if I'll maybe weave my questions in later. I'm sure we have lots of hands. So one over here.
Thanks. Thank you for calling me. So my name is Michael White, and I want to ask a question of Mark Bray. First, I want to say thank you. I think it is obviously very difficult to argue the position of violence because we do live in a situation where most people want to defend nonviolence. And I think at the same time, it's obviously clear that we do need people to argue a vigorous defense of violence, because if violence is necessary, we need to know that. We need to know that information. But I want you to go deeper, okay? Because I think that it's clear that obviously there is a distinction between revolutionary violence and non-revolutionary violence. And to me, I think my biggest critique of the Antifa is that it still feels like it's non-revolutionary violence in the sense that they are not doing what you referenced, which is trying to hold and attain and hold sovereignty. So I guess what I'm saying is, give us a self-aware critique of Antifa that shows how violence can and should be used to attain sovereignty going forward.
Okay, thank you for that question. Are we going to just one at a time? So I think that's a good question in the sense of understanding militant anti-fascism, Antifa, as what one German anti-fascist that I interviewed described as a firefighting operation. It's a politics intended to stop what is perceived as an immediate threat. I think the most accurate way of understanding it within the broader radical left is sort of one tool on a kind of Swiss Army knife of revolutionary politics. The goal of militant anti-fascist groups in most cases, at most times, is to respond to far-right organizing. But it's important to see it as part of the broader whole, where most of the people that are part of these groups are also union organizers and environmentalists and community organizers who, in a sort of positive, constructive politics sense, are doing that under a different umbrella heading. So in most cases, most Antifa groups, as Antifa groups, do not see that vehicle as the vehicle for creating a new world so much as stopping a descent into a much worse world, and do the kind of politics you're referring to under other headings at other times. And one of the kind of most ironic things about the conversations around it is that many of the people who wage or who create the most harshest critiques of anti-fascism are really actively supporting the very same people when they do different things without wearing masks, without knowing it. Because the anti-fascists that I interviewed, many of them have been active in Occupy Wall Street, in Black Lives Matter, were at Standing Rock. And so this is basically just a cross-section of the American radical left. Just wanted to quickly address a couple of other interesting points that David made. I think we should just distinguish between civility as a dictionary definition and its political usage. I'm not arguing for being a jerk. I'm just arguing that people who support separating migrant families shouldn't have a moment of peace on earth. That's all. And also, stop signs are not obviously violent, but if you run through one and you get a ticket and you don't pay the ticket, and then a collection agency comes and you refuse to pay that ticket, you will find state violence eventually. So that was sort of my broader analysis. But point taken that stop signs are really useful. Just talking about violence. Anyway, thanks.
I think the microphone's coming.
Can I make a little comment on the last question? I'm aware the last question was not addressed to me, and I'll be brief, but there is a history of resistance to fascism, which is itself complex. There were street fights in pre-Nazi Germany between the communists and the already Nazi brown shirts. That was part of the, organized enthusiasm and incivility of Germany preceding January 1933 when Hitler became chancellor. There was a doctrine current among the Communist Party of Germany called the doctrine of social fascism, which said that moderates of the time, the socialists, those who were not revolutionary communists but merely what we would now call social democrats, were objectively on the side of the Nazis, and therefore it was important utterly to reject their help and to fight them as well as fight against the uniform-wearing Nazis already in the street. This was so disastrous a miscalculation that it prompted Trotsky, who wrote some very good pamphlets on those street battles, to say that the theory of social fascism seems to have been invented by Stalin for the mere purpose of gumming up our brains. I'm no friend of the establishment of the Democratic Party at this moment, but I think to suppose that every office holder is someone you should fight against, and every governor who's trying to maintain the rule of law is somebody you should fight against as intensely as you do against the right-wing crowd. That's a dangerous argument, and tactically it's going to lead to unhappy results. Street fights will lead to a police crackdown, and if you think the result of a police crackdown is going to be greater strength for the insurgency, you might want to look at the kind of popular support that exists on the other side too. So I want to say only that there is a prehistory of that kind of spontaneous work against actual fascists, and that the prehistory is not altogether encouraging.
So I think in public discourse, we hear the term radical and radicalism thrown around a lot. My favorite definition is from Angela Davis, which is that radical simply means grasping things at the root. How would each of you define radical or radicalism, and how or when do you think radicalism is useful?
I like that definition. Yeah, at the root. So, I mean, what you consider to be radical has everything to do with what you think the root of an issue is. In terms of how it's used in the left spectrum, a radical left would be in some way or another anti-capitalist, for starters. Others would just say that's a sort of a precondition for actually being left in a meaningful sense. But, you know, again, these are kind of ongoing debates. For me, though, I love that definition of being at the roots, and so I think that's a good point of departure, and then everyone can kind of take it where it takes them.
I gave the floor to Mark just now because I'm not quick to identify a radicalism. It can be a radicalism of so many kinds and in so many areas that I would want to offer a sharp definition of. I suppose I would say myself, I'm radical. It's not a political conviction, I'm sorry to say. It probably comes under some other heading. I'm radical against arbitrary power, which means unchecked power. And I'm radical against inhibiting the telling of the truth, which I think is one of the difficult things human beings do. And I think I won't go so far as the truth shall make you free, but without truth, no thing that I could call freedom will ever come about. So those are two, I prefer the adjective to the noun. Radical opposition to arbitrary power, radical support for the freedom to tell the truth. And I think that we don't have any better protections against that than in the case of power, the Fifth Amendment in the Bill of Rights, and in the case of truth, the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. If anybody asks, I have it in my pocket, and I'll be glad to read you the wonderful words.
Maybe if we have time. There's a hand on the end of the aisle here.
I just wanted to make a comment, and I'd like you to comment back, because I don't know exactly how to phrase this as a question. But movements that we tend to think of as nonviolent, in a way, have been sanitized after they've been successful. So the liberation of South Africa did not come as a result of entirely of nonviolence. There were mass demonstrations, there were boycotts, and there was also an armed wing that committed what would today be called terrorist act. The civil rights movement, led by Martin Luther King, was not nonviolent in the sense that we would define it today, that is, as the common parlance would define it today. Civil rights movement, people who worked in the South armed themselves. They had self-defense units because people knew that they would be attacked. And I can tell you from knowing civil rights workers who worked in the South that at night they were attacked and they shot back. They didn't wait, and they were not murdered by people in the Klan. So I think the more interesting question might be to look at how nonviolence gets redefined by the hagiography of successful movements, and how the mix of a popular movement supported as it may be by violent means differs from the way in which a popular movement which arises solely by violence works. So just one last example I would like to give, which is the way in which the generally nonviolent demonstrations of tens of thousands of people at the Gaza border now has been redefined by the Israelis, who, by the way, are killing them by the hundreds, as a violent movement. So I just love your comments on that.
Yeah, right on. So that's why I concluded by saying maybe a point of focus can be questions of solidarity, because despite a lot of these disagreements about philosophy and tactics that people pursuing justice have, there's a lot in terms of what we want that's actually overlapping, and how can we avoid having wedges driven within our movements that make us turn and attack each other verbally rather than working together. And the issue of this wedge doesn't exclusively pertain to questions of violence and nonviolence. We can already see it in terms of the efforts by the Republicans to turn anti-Kavanaugh protesters into a mob simply for shouting at politicians. There's an example where even if you disagree with the actions of some of these protesters, by all means, you know, we can have informed, interesting conversations and debates about it. But I think looking instead, how can we stand in solidarity and build a broad movement that can weather the fact that we're going to have a very interesting, complex, difficult array of tactical perspectives. I'm not encouraging violent movements. I'm just saying there's sometimes when self-defense politically makes sense, and recognizing that historically violence has coexisted with most liberatory social movements. But I think that point of departure is useful, and it's useful to get beyond the kind of apples or oranges debate that this often boils down to.
Now I'll be the one speaking of context briefly. Israel, in its response to the protesters from Gaza and on the West Bank, a long-lasting kind of response, it has been much worse, much more oppressive than the British in India were in the 1940s, or than the US government was when the civil rights movement took up force in the 1950s. And if you're dealing with a state that has no respect for a mass nonviolent movement by something approaching a majority, you're in a very different situation from what either Gandhi or Martin Luther King confronted. I want to agree with that without pretending to know what, if I were a Palestinian in Israel now, I would say should be done. South Africa in the 70s and 80s, when the movement against apartheid arose, was a black majority country. It's a very important fact. And I'll just think about what that means in relation to the acceptance or rejection of certain tactics. But it is an error, and a very common one, I'm afraid it's becoming, to ascribe to Gandhi or Martin Luther King the view that nonviolent resistance was merely tactical for them. It was a principle for them. They followed it, practiced it, in both cases at the cost of their lives, and preached it steadily to their followers. Now, the arming of themselves by some civil rights workers in the South, not under the direction of Martin Luther King, because it was a wide movement, is a different thing. And I think their self-defense is defensible. But don't amalgamate those two phenomena and say Martin Luther King told people to shoot back. That would be wrong. Gandhi addressed this particular question on the difference between individual self-defense and the principle by which a mass movement should be guided in a very interesting passage from an essay called The Doctrine of the Sword from August 1920. I'm going to read this just because it's so interesting and because I said he was a thinker, and this will prove it to you. Such being the hold that the doctrine of the sword has on the majority of mankind, he means violence, and as success of non-cooperation depends principally on the absence of violence during its pendency, and as my views in this matter affect the conduct of a large number of people, I am anxious to state them as clearly as possible. I do believe that where there is only a choice between cowardice and violence, I would advise violence. I'm reading all of a passage that is often quoted with distortion in part, so take it slow. Thus, when my eldest son asked me what he should have done had he been present when I was almost fatally assaulted in 1908, whether he should have run away and seen me killed, or whether he should have used his physical force, which he could and wanted to use, and defended me, I told him that it was his duty to defend me, even by using violence. Hence it was that I took part in the Boer War, the so-called Zulu Rebellion, and the late war. The Boer War on the English side, by the way. Hence also do I advocate training in arms for those who believe in the method of violence. For those who believe in the method of violence, with whom he disagrees. I would rather have India resort to arms in order to defend her honor than that she should in a cowardly manner become or remain a helpless witness to her own dishonor. But I believe that nonviolence is infinitely superior to violence. Forgiveness is more manly than punishment. Forgiveness adorns a soldier. But abstinence is forgiveness only when there is power to punish. It is meaningless when it pretends to proceed from a helpless creature. A mouse hardly forgives a cat when it allows itself to be torn to pieces by her. I, therefore, appreciate the sentiment of those who cry out for the condign, that means deserved, punishment of General Dyer and his ilk. They would tear him to pieces if they could, but I do not believe India to be helpless. I do not believe myself to be a helpless creature. Only I want to use India's and my strength for a better purpose. Let me not be misunderstood. Strength does not come from physical capacity. It comes from an indomitable will. Very complex thought.
So we had a hand over here, and then over there.
Hi, my name's David Panagor. I'm actually a public official. I'm a town manager. And I hear this conversation visited in my communities. Civility, suppression, civil disobedience, all the things we talk about, violence, nonviolence. And my question is, when we talked about, I heard the comments about when we envision this is the society we become. We have these conversations about the justification. Do either of you see how this is not just working on a national level, but how this is working on a community level? That the way we treat each other locally, and the issues that we choose locally, and the violence with words and shunning and behavior, how this is starting to become part of American society at a local level? Are you guys seeing that, or is this only a national academic conversation about global issues? I wonder, when we look at this, do you guys see how this, in your work, is visiting your relationships in the colleges that you work at and the communities that you are? Or is this only at a national presidential level or something like that?
I'll be the fast one this time, first and fast. I would associate myself with President Botstein's remarks a few minutes ago about the importance of physical conversation, of the public space being used for public discussion. I don't like the word conversation. I probably react against the word conversation as strongly as he does against the word civility. Discussion can be occasionally impolite, though there's bounds it shouldn't cross. But when we're talking to people, the idea usually is we're going to keep on talking, and that some good of coming to know each other's views and maybe improving each other's views comes out of that. I think that social media are the enemy of democracy as we have known it. I think that's true on all sides. They're a very good means for rapid organization, and at the time of the hopeful feelings about the Arab Spring in Tahrir Square and so on, there was a sense, at least Americans were made to believe it, that social media could be a means for good, unprecedented, unique in human history. I think it is also a means for harm of political discussion and of conversation between neighbors. In colleges, this hardly becomes an issue. In a place like Yale, and I imagine Bard, the opinion runs so far in excess of 99% against the current government that there's no reason for argument. And yet, even so, within the kinds of divisions and shades of political views that we have, there's almost no conversation because students walk out of class wearing earbuds and looking at their gizmos. That situation has to be improved if there's going to be discussion at the social level that leads to political change that is rational and actually reforming.
I might add that you can in fact follow this conference on Twitter through a hashtag.
Just a quick response as to the relationship sort of in my workplace and everyday life. Yes, it has affected me quite a bit on a local level. I was denounced by the president of Dartmouth College. Fortunately, more than 120 faculty supported my academic freedom, and this kind of campus organizing generated the faculty to form an AAUP chapter at Dartmouth to address a variety of other grievances, and actually in the long run was, I think, a pretty productive thing to happen. I received a number of threats for my work, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, it has affected me personally, immediately, locally. I think it is interesting that you use the phrase violence of words. Not that that's wrong. We can very well make an argument that words can be violent, and I'm not trying to...
No, I just don't have as much time as you do to talk. So I was quick.
I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying it's interesting that that's one way to look at violence that we should take into account when we look at the whole conversation as to what is or is not violent. The notion, though, that when people are being very heated verbally in political spaces in a way that's contentious and perhaps uncivil, that is the most problematic aspect of American politics. I think, not that you're saying that it is, but some people portray it as if it is, that is a concern, that if in your community you have a prison or you have a detention center, these are things that people should get heated about addressing, and if they're not, that's a kind of violence as well.
So there's a hand on the end of the aisle here.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. I was just wondering, yesterday there was a panel on activism, and it talked about how students went to the Kavanaugh protests, and they were kind of systematically told, here's where you're going to get arrested, and here is your bail, and this is what we want you to do. And I'm just wondering the panel's thoughts on if this is still considered a form of protest, and what you think, if there is a point to this sort of systematic way that we protest now.
There's a lot of debate in left circles over the kind of stage managing of civil disobedience and resistance. I think there's legitimate arguments on both sides of it, but I think that the critique that maybe you're hinting at, that I am very sympathetic to, is that there comes a point when, like, if you negotiate with the police for arrests in advance and you stage where people are going to be, the level of resistance and conflict that is potentially manifest in an act of nonviolent resistance dissipates. So I think that it is problematic when you have NGOs or political parties or organizations dictating how everyone should resist. I think that is a problem. That having been said, though, I think there is something to be said for people who show up to a protest respecting the work of people who have made the protest happen all along. So I think it's not black and white, but I do think that there is a concern at times when we stage manage it to such a degree that it kind of loses its force.
I have my computer. Hi, thank you. So my question is for all three of you, and it's about civility. President Botstein brought up this idea of physical space versus social media. David, you just reiterated it. And this idea of the physical public sphere is an idea that's very important to Arendt, as you know. And my question is, do you think that we have an ethical, political responsibility today to ensure that all people feel safe to go into the public sphere and voice their opinions and engage in political conversation and protest actions?
I guess so much hangs on the word "safe" there, and in the campus context, that's a word I have suspicions about. There should be. You should be free to invite who you want and to remove or rather exclude whom you want from the room you live in. But public spaces on campus, I don't think should be designated safe on the basis of some group's desire to have it be just to themselves for a certain occasion, which has not been planned in advance. I suppose what you're getting at also is the feeling of impotence that a great many people without experience in public speaking or in public interaction on political issues may have. And to use a word that has come up occasionally in these days, I think the remedy for that, to improve that state of things, is education, which gives you, in a setting like Bard or Yale where I teach, the practice at speaking, at hearing other people speak, at replying to points with evidence and argument. A lot of people don't have that kind of practice. They don't get it in the shouting matches at Thanksgiving in their families, or at Passover, where one faction, usually younger, disagrees about Israel with the other faction, usually older. And it would be good for education, including adult education, to develop an increasing confidence about such speech by more citizens. On the other hand, I'll go back to my anti-social media point. The belief that you are engaging in public discourse by writing 140-character long messages seems to me such an abject defection of responsibility that it to me beggars belief that any intelligent person would do it. And yet we know we have colleagues in these places, universities, that do it. We have public officials that do it. Bad example as Trump may be, there are a great many public officials who are copying him and doing as bad as they can, even if they're on the other side. So we need more exemplary public speech of the sort that Arendt had a very high-minded notion of. But how to make it exemplary is the problem.
I'll just say very quickly, I think it's maybe better to speak of multiple public spheres, and I think we on the left should view them tactically. So we should be committed to creating welcoming, inclusive public spheres for those who have less power. And we should be prepared to say that there should be no safe public sphere for white supremacists. That public spheres should be seen as weapons and resources, and those are just as subject to political and tactical considerations as anything else. A question in the very back.
Hi, my name's Austin Dilley. I'm a sophomore at Bard, and I've been taking just finished up a seminar class at the Hannah Arendt Center. We've been with Micah White, and we've been talking a lot about a theory of activism. This idea that we can teach how to be an activist, teach how to create social change. And I've been struggling with this question myself. Is it possible to dilute 3,000 years of revolution and social movement into something that works in any time and place? And I'm wondering what your guys' thoughts are on this idea.
Well, my first comment would be that I think there are practical skills that can be taught that are useful for political action that are vaguely transferable across various different contexts. But that my political focus is less on activism per se than organizing that empowers people to pursue their material and social interests. And you don't have to be an activist to be involved in a movement that pursues that, or to work with people in similar circumstances to get there per se, although of course those skills help. There's interesting debates within the left of what is called activism versus what is called organizing. I think it gets unnecessarily polarized, and there's benefits to what is called both, and there's a lot of gray area. So I'm not trying to make like a larger point, but that I think that there's a tendency towards a notion of professionalization of activism, which I think is really problematic and counterproductive towards people feeling like they can build a better world without having to step outside of who they are.
Almost all my protests that could have registered in the public eye has been in the form of writing, not marching and getting arrested. And most of it has been since the year 2001, when I think my country drove off a cliff that we haven't yet recovered from. I do think, therefore, I mean, the objects of my protest have been America's wars. We're now in 5, and 6, including Yemen, and in support of civil liberties. It is a source of regret to me that on campus discussions, particularly, the campus left can't be assumed to be friendly to civil liberties. I only want to make one point, not even a point, or a reminder about the potential cooperation always between a protest movement and a political party. So in the late 1850s, you had founded a new political party, the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln, close to the roots of that, whose policy on slavery was no extension of slavery, period. They saw themselves as, what to say, the moderate extension of the Whig Party, and not at all identical with abolitionists. One of the leaders of the abolitionist movement was Frederick Douglass. In his great speech, unveiling the Freeman's Monument, I think it's 1871 in Washington, D.C., Douglass spoke this sentence about Lincoln, and it's about the relation between a radical protester and a what should we say, a wise and courageous leader working within a political system. Douglass said, viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln was tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But considering the sentiments of his countrymen, which he was bound as a statesman to consult. He was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. So you have to live with that complex thought, I think, if you want to look ahead in some way to the cooperation at times between a political party or an established large organization and the smaller protest movements that are seeking to be an impetus to a different kind of change.
So we've just about 3 minutes left, so I think what we'll do is we'll collect several questions and then we'll give final comments to our guests and we'll wrap it up there. So maybe 3 questions. One on the one at the very end of the aisle here, one right there. Is there another hand maybe on the side? Or and right there in the center.
In terms
Sorry, I'm making this really hard on the people running around mics. You want to keep your hands up?
Okay.
Hi. I just wanted to sort of ask about the implicit violence and nonviolent protest. And specifically, you brought up Gandhi a lot, and Martin Luther King, for example. Some of the most powerful images that come out of the civil rights movement are of the police violently assaulting protesters. Gandhi's tactics involved a lot of sort of creating an object of violence to be presented on a public sphere. And then I wonder what is like a public gathering or this enormous mass of people in the example of Gandhi or Martin Luther King? Is it a public opinion poll, as Mark Bray put it, or is there some sort of implicit threat of violence in large public gatherings? And I was wondering, the question is the power consolidated in public protest and public gathering based in violence and implicit violence, the threat of a large group of people, or is it something else?
There's we're just going to gather some last questions.
Yesterday, from the discussion from Rise Up Kingston, there was a mention of capitalism. And when you ask the question, what is violence? So far, I've heard no discussion of the market, the coercion of work, and if you can't find work, you starve. I mean, so the state is not simply a creature of its own, it's related to the market, it enforces the market. And I was wondering if anti-capitalism is an important part of protest movements today.
Great. And then
hello? Hi, I was interested in hearing each of you speak on the Second Amendment and the original context for which it was drafted, not what some of my neighbors in my small town think of as the right to go deer hunting, and its applicability, if any, as a tool of protest for today's issues, because I know there are groups on the right that think that, and just wondering your thoughts.
Short final responses.
You want to jump into that?
Sure. I'll jump into all of them. The matter of the violence that was the violence that resulted from mass nonviolent disobedience, that policemen directed hoses and brought dogs to attack the King's protesters in the American South, or that the British fired on Gandhi's protesters in Amritsar. I'm not sure what the maybe metaphysical point was there. The protest was nonviolent. The response of public authority was violent. In both cases, in the very long run, it led to the abolition of the oppressive system in question. The nonviolence one is speaking of refers to the principle of conduct by the protesters. It is not doubted that the state is a source of violence. And perhaps mass gatherings as such, or perhaps just the very scene of disorder as such, causes such friction, causes such, neurotic abreactions in people who see it, that authorities are going to clamp down, and nonviolence is the cause of violence. But I think that's an over-subtle point. The principle of nonviolent action is not itself violent. I won't comment on capitalism, just that we have a rich vocabulary for talking about these things. Misery, oppression, violence tends to be a word that we use for something more immediate, physical, and causing physical pain. But I'm not going to get into that. For the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment, which I'll read the text of, you're quite right, has been very abused in interpretation. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's one sentence with one grammar. If you have any Latin, the grammar is called ablative absolute, and the key phrase is being necessary to the security of a free state. The militia is the hook on which the right to bear arms hangs. These people were readers of Machiavelli and of Cato's letters and Locke. They believed that a standing army was an undesirable thing. We've now had a standing army since 1945, completely against the principles of the Constitution. So, in view of that, the danger posed by state power, smaller groups of people, if they were well regulated, that is drilled, trained, etc., were allowed to bear arms. Something like the National Guard is there contemplated, but a National Guard that is not controlled by the central state. So whatever you think of the Second Amendment, it doesn't mean everybody can buy a bazooka, or any of the other automatic machine gun-like weapons that are now available. I think the greatest danger is from a merging of the Second Amendment with the First. Adamant as I am in defense of free speech and assembly, the idea of weapons being carried to assemblies by some people attending them seems to me antithetical to free speech. It impinges on free speech.
Yes, anti-capitalism is important. Yes, capital is violence. It's a violent social relation. I would have gotten into it more, but I focused more on examples of violence that I thought would be more popularly self-evident, but you're right that is a good example. The issue of the kind of potentially violent spectacle of popular resistance, I think, is an interesting point, but I would make two follow-up points. One is that most instances of nonviolent protests that are brutally repressed by the police do not generate popular support, unfortunately. Attached to that is the point that many nonviolent protests, when they get attacked by the police, are labeled as violent in the media. I've been in plenty of protests where the police started the violence and it gets reported as conflicts or scuffles or what have you, which points to the fact that as much as in theory you may want to have a nonviolent protest, it may not be reported that way. Also, there are times in the past when violent protests have been brutally repressed and still generated support. One example that comes to mind would be in May '68 in France, the police, the brutal suppression of students on the barricades, brutal suppression by the police generated a lot of popular support. So, it's important to look at it contextually, politically. What do people think as different kinds of legitimate action? As far as the Second Amendment per se, I'm much less knowledgeable about the intricacies of the Constitution. But the way it is interpreted, whether or not it should be, is that many forms of firearms are legally available. There are some groups on the left, both in the past and in the present, that take up arms. Redneck Revolt, for example. Trigger Warning, which is a queer and trans gun club. Huey P. Newton Gun Club. There are a number of examples like this. I understand why that would be a decision that people who feel like they're under threat of attack would take, but it's not the kind of politics I do.
Great. Will everyone join me in thanking our two speakers? So we'll be taking a quick break and reconvening in a few minutes at 11:30 for the next panel. So thank you.